Okay, so liminal spaces. The first thing that we should do to understand this topic is to clearly define what a liminal space is. A space in architecture is any physical space that is defined by an architectural element. This can be anything from a wall, a roof, or a floor, or a combination of those. The liminal, on the other hand, comes from the Latin word limen, which means a threshold or transition. By combining these two, we get a space that is transitional or is a threshold. Since these spaces are transitional, they operate as connection points between other spaces. And here we come into a distinction that is really important between static and dynamic spaces. This distinction is actually really important in analyzing the nature of liminal spaces, since the liminal experience relies on the dynamic nature of the liminal spaces. In architecture, dynamic spaces are where movement happens. That's why they are not places where the user stays still and experiences his or her surroundings. It is exactly the distortion of these two qualities that gives rise to the liminal experience, the dynamic and the transitional. Though these are not the only factors that play into the experience, but we will talk about those two later on in the video. Now that we have defined what a liminal space is, it is time to go in detail to what makes a liminal experience. The physical elements that we talked about earlier define only one part of our experience in these spaces. So according to the unitary theory by Henry Lefebvre, which states the following: the space is a social item that includes or should include three elements, which are the perceived, the conceived, and the lived. Okay, so let's talk about the physical elements and how different settings in these spaces give different experiences. We did talk previously about the physical elements that make up a space, but those are not the only things that govern the space itself. Other elements that can be called secondary are things like lighting, the furnishing, that plays into the perception of these spaces. Plus, there are other principles that govern the physical nature of these spaces, things like scale, orientation, openness, etc. So a combination of a space that is huge, statically lit, and fully enclosed will convey a different experience from a space that is smaller in scale and is open to the outside. The second part that plays into the liminal experience is the conceived, also known as the ideality. This factor can have 2 points of view. Both can play along at the same time. These are the objective and the subjective. The spaces that we talked about earlier can be conceived objectively, aka by qualities that are unique to the human nature, and by the universal human experience, which arises from said human nature. Now, other creatures can have their own perceptions on these spaces, but since the built environment is built for humans, we do not consider those other creatures. There are many human traits that can be evoked by these spaces. One trait that is universal to all humans is fear. Liminal spaces, when experienced in settings that are not normal, can evoke a sense of fear in humans. This fear, just like any other, comes from a place of uncertainty. On the other hand, the subjective conception of these spaces can differ from a person to person. This can be things like taste and personal opinions unique to each individual that leads to a different judgment and experience. A corridor that is paved with a certain type of tiles or is furnished with some type of carpet can evoke different emotions based on the person and their own human experiences in life. And the third part of the liminal experience is the lived or the experiential. In the case of liminal spaces, what we mean by this is the setting. Just as mentioned before, liminal spaces are designed for movement. They are transitional and dynamic spaces that you are supposed to move in. So experiencing and living these spaces in settings they were not designed for gives the feeling that we all know and see in liminal media. Things like the abandoned hallways or the mysterious lighting or just being in those spaces in different times when people are absent. But I must also say that the nature of these spaces is enough to live the liminal experience. The unconventional settings that we are talking about right now work more as amplifiers to the experience rather than a must factor for these liminal experiences to rise. Therefore, a combination of the physical, the conception of the said physical, both objectively and subjectively, with the lived element leads to the ultimate experience that we have all been talking about in this video, which is the liminal experience. A side note, I did not include other dramatic factors that we see online. mainly because this section of the video is about real scenarios that we live in this world. And those ones do not happen in our world, so we did not include them. Okay, so after all of this theoretical talking, I think it's time for me to give you some live examples on liminal spaces. We will look at those spaces and analyze the liminality in them from all perspectives: the physical, the conceptual, and the lived. So according to the plans that are shown right now to you, we see three types of transitional spaces. The first one is the most common type of liminal spaces that we see online, which I call the journey-based liminal spaces. This one includes both linear and non-linear transitional spaces and 2 points or multiple points of thresholds. A really obvious example of this type of liminal spaces are corridors, which we can see a lot of in liminal core videos. Or it could be places like atriums, a space that is filled with movement and leads to one or more than one potential threshold. This type of space takes us into a journey rather than an instantaneous moment of transition. The second plan shows two side-by-side spaces where the transition between them happens instantaneously. I call these the momentary liminal spaces. The liminal experience here is sudden and results in a more dramatic experience because of the lack of a transitional period. This type of liminal spaces can actually be seen in the backrooms, where we have multiple spaces that follow each other in sequence. Another type of buildings where we can see this type of transition are historical museums, where sudden changes can give a dramatic experience between different halls. We can see this in the floor plan of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. The third type does not have strong physical elements to give a distinction between spaces. I call it the experiential liminal spaces. The experience here is much more subtle and vague. We can live this experience in places like porches or balconies, for example. These spaces act as transition points between the interior and the exterior, two types of environments that contrast in their usage and relation to the human that uses them. This video was mainly about liminality in architectural spaces until now, but most of the mentioned rules apply to urban spaces too. Urban spaces differ heavily from architectural spaces in the experience they give to the user. Now, I can't go on and on about the difference between these spaces, but that's not the topic of this video. Anyways, we can apply the same transitional qualities needed for a space to be considered liminal to urban spaces too. A great example for this would be a very well-known space that we see in liminal media online, which is the suburbs. But in this video, we'll be talking about the modern-day suburbs in America and Canada too, which came about after World War II. Suburbs do exist in other countries and did exist in the US prior to World War II, but those differ in their nature and the qualities that we need for an amplified liminal experience, so we will talk about the ones after World War II. So to understand what makes suburbs liminal inherently and not just by accident, we need to understand them from an urban point of view. Suburbs are actually transitional spaces. They act as the transitional spaces between the urban and the rural. If we go back in time into other historical periods, for example, let's say the Middle Ages, the transition between the rural and the urban was instantaneous. What played the role of this transition point was the defense walls, things that we do not have anymore in our cities. So the liminal experience back then was instantaneous, and this can fall under the second type of liminal spaces. But in modern day American cities, suburbs play this role, adding a transitional element to this liminal experience. Thus, the liminal experience becomes gradual rather than instantaneous. Plus, suburbs have the other two pillars of the liminal experience as stated in the unitary theory. Of course, we as humans, as stated before, have our own conception of these spaces, and the lived part is already amplified in the case of suburbs. You know, we all know about the pictures and videos that we see online about the suburbs, and without exaggeration, they show how creepy they are. Suburbs are transitional spaces that are devoid of life, and that's because of the urban planning laws in the US that divides the city into strictly divided uses. There's only the residential here and the commercial there, and nothing there is mixed. There are no static spaces for other activities to take place and give life to the surroundings, only copy-paste houses where people go in and there's no activities whatsoever. So the liminal experience in the perception part relies also on the factor of emptiness and surrealism. The emptiness part is obvious and is explained by the zoning laws in the US, but the surreal part comes from the expectation of a lively place, but then you go there and it's all emptiness. So all of these combined turns the suburbs into the perfect example of liminal spaces on an urban scale. Okay, so now we will talk about liminal core. Liminal core was popularized in 2019 by the creepypasta The Backrooms on 4chan. The Backrooms is a fictional realm you get transported to by no clipping. In its beginnings, the Backrooms only consisted of yellow office-like spaces. An anonymous user on 4chan describes the Backrooms as follows. If you're not careful and you no clip out of reality in the wrong areas, you'll end up in the Backrooms, where it is nothing but the stink of old moist carpet, the madness of mono yellow, the endless background noise of fluorescent lights at maximum hum buzz, and approximately 600 million square miles of randomly segmented empty rooms to be trapped in. God save you if you hear something wandering around nearby, because it sure as hell has heard you. The part where the user talks about the segmented spaces brings to mind the second type of liminal spaces, the threshold-based one. As stated before, this type of planning is used in galleries to turn a static space, which in normal cases is used for functioning, into transitional one that requires its users to always be in movement. And it is this exact segmented nature of the backrooms that gives it its liminal quality, an endless number of spaces in which you must always be moving and get away from an unknown entity that is after you. And of course, not to forget about the perception and the lived parts that turns the backrooms into the perfect type of liminal spaces. As the 4chan user describes, mono yellow carpet color, same with walls, the eerie static lighting, and the abandonment, plus the threat of always being followed. As it is the case with everything on the internet, people started to hop in and add their own levels to the backrooms. And as of now, in the backrooms, there are like millions and millions of levels, which all lack any quality, any liminal qualities. And this was what I was talking about in the intro. These spaces rely on psychology and the emotions that they invoke. You know, the most famous of these things are nostalgia. There is nothing liminal to them. They also include so many unrealistic scenarios. I mean, the original Backrooms is also a bit unrealistic too, but only in the part of no clipping. Even the feeling of being followed by some entity is realistic because we can live the same feeling in real life too. But as conclusion, all the things that have been said about the original Backrooms, everything from the physical part and the perception of this physical part, both objectively and subjectively, with the lived experience that we have in those spaces, they all combined makes the Backrooms the perfect liminal spaces, which makes me feel like they were designed with liminality in mind and not just some random funny experiment that the maker of this liminal space did. Okay, now to wrap it all up, I made this video just to clear everything up about liminal spaces and give an architectural perspective on it. There is so much garbage floating around when it comes to this topic, and it is just annoying. This video also serves as a tool to give people what I call liminal literacy. So when you go online and see spaces, you know which one are liminal and which one are not. And when you know they are liminal, you know why they are liminal. So if you like this video, don't forget to put a like and subscribe and comment all your thoughts about liminal spaces.